The movie Saving Private Ryan ends with Tom Hanks's character, Captain Miller, uttering his last words to Private Ryan, which were, "Earn this, earn this." You see, almost all of Miller's platoon had been killed trying to save Private Ryan, so he tells Ryan to earn this. Well, as Matt Damon, who plays Private Ryan, is looking down at Captain Miller's body, he then morphs into his aged self some 60 years into the future as he stands over Captain Miller's headstone at the Normandy cemetery. And Ryan says to the headstone, to Miller, that he remembers Miller's last words and that he has lived his life the best he could in the hopes of earning those sacrifices. Now, the passage we're looking at today, it's not your typical Good Friday passage, is it? But I wanted to do something a little different this year, sort of try and step outside of the Gospels to look at another passage that speaks of Jesus' death. And Philippians 2 is a great place to go for this. And one of the reasons for that is that Philippians 2 is about how we can live a life worthy, just like Private Ryan had hoped he'd lived. In that final scene, the aged Private Ryan asks his wife, "Have I led a good life? Have I been a good man?" And I suspect most people want that too. Most people do not want to be known as sort of a good-for-nothing dirtbag, am I right? Well, here's the thing. In Philippians 1 verse 27, so this is just 3 verses before the passage we read today. So if you look up at the top of the page, the Apostle Paul says this: "Whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ." Right? And so the passage that we just had read for us is telling the Philippians what a worthy life involves. Now, how awesome is that? Okay, Private Ryan, he had no idea whether he'd earned the sacrifices of Captain Miller and his platoon. But what we've got here is God himself, through his Apostle Paul, telling us what a worthy life looks like. And it's really simple. It comes down to just one thing, as we see in verses 1 to 4. But while it's simple, it's not easy. All right, so Paul doesn't just tell us what we have to do to live a life worthy. He then tells us how to do it in verses 5 to 8, which is kind of the center of this passage. But even better than that is that Paul rounds out this famous little passage in verses 9 to 11 by telling us why it's good for us to do this. And there are 3 points for today. We're looking at the what, the how, and the why of living a life worthy, which, like I said, most of us want, do we not? So let's dive in and see if we can live a life worthy. So Paul begins his passage in chapter 2, verse 1. He's basically describing Christians here. So he says this: "Therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion," all right? Now, each of these 4 things, they could get a sermon on their own, okay? But for today, we're just going to note that these are descriptions of a Christian, all right? What Paul is basically saying is, if you're a Christian, then, verse 2, "Make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind." So Paul says, if you're a Christian, then be united as Christians. Friends, one of Satan's favourite things is to see a church tear itself apart. I heard of an Anglican church here in Sydney a few years ago that was suffering from significant infighting. The bishop told me there were 3 factions in this church, and all 3 of them were behaving in an ungodly manner. And Satan just sat back with a box of popcorn and watched his work unfold. Now, thankfully, that church is doing better at the moment. But look, fighting and fractions are a few of Satan's favourite things. Paul, on the other hand, loves seeing churches united. And in the next verse, he tells us how to do that. And this is the main point of our passage. passage. If you want to read with me, verses 3 and 4. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. All right, so this is the what of a worthy life, and that is humility. If you and I want to live a life worthy of the gospel of Christ, it comes down to just one thing. Just one thing. That's all we need. Right, so one of my favourite movie scenes of all time is at the end of the movie The Man in the Iron Mask. And it's when D'Artagnan takes a blade for the king, saving the king's life. And as D'Artagnan lays there, his last words are, "All my life, this is the death I always wanted." Right, to be a worthy musketeer means just one thing. It means a willingness to give your life for the king. And in the same way, to live a life worthy of the gospel of Christ means just one thing, according to Paul. And that is humility. Now, in case we don't know what humility is, Paul then spells it out for us, okay? It is valuing others above ourselves. That's what he says in verse 4. Now, this doesn't mean believing others are better than yourself. It's not what he's talking about here. So for example, if we were to ask Jesus, who is the most qualified person to save humanity, Jesus would say himself and be completely humble in doing so. All right? So humility isn't believing others are better than you. It is valuing others, considering others, treating others as of greater importance than you. And this isn't easy, is it? Truth be told, it's probably the hardest thing you can do in life. Friends, there are people who have really hurt me in ministry. There are people who have really hurt my wife in ministry. And to turn around and have to treat these people with love when it feels that they've treated me with hatred, to actually put their interests ahead of my own when they've done the opposite to me, well, that's really hard. But that's what it takes to live a life worthy of the gospel of Christ. Right? It's just one thing. It is to consider others as of greater importance than you, to put their interests ahead of your own. Now, as it turns out, Paul knows how hard it is to live a life worthy. And so in verses 5 to 8, he gives us some help by pointing to an example. Truth be told, it's actually the example of humility, of a life worthy. So he says in verse 5, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset of Christ Jesus. All right, if you want to be humble, if you want to live a life worthy of the gospel, then follow Jesus' example. And we hear what that is in verse 6. Who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking on the very nature of a servant. Now, for those who may not be aware of this, the incarnation, that's when Jesus was born as a baby on that very first Christmas, that was not Jesus' first moment of existence. All right, according to the Bible, Jesus has existed for all of eternity as one of the three persons of the triune Godhead. And what Paul is getting at here is that in his pre-incarnate state, Jesus enjoyed the full glory of God. Now, why is that? It's because Jesus was God. All right? He was bright and shiny and beautiful. He had infinite power and knowledge and wisdom. He lived in perfect comfort and security and joy, and he had 10,000 times 10,000 angelic beings, the most glorious beings ever created, who lived to serve and worship him day after day. Can you imagine what that would be like? It's like living in a 7-star resort every day of your life where you have all your needs and wants met. All right, if you can picture that, well, you're not even close to how amazing his existence had been for all of eternity. All right, it is beyond human comprehension of how awesome Jesus was for all of eternity. But here's the thing. Jesus realized he could not use that godlike glory and power and honor and comfort to his own advantage. And so what he did was he emptied himself of that glory and power and honor and comfort. Right? Can you even fathom someone doing that? Like, think of the most powerful people in our world today. All right, when Putin came to power in 1999, one of the first things he did was he made changes to the political rules so that he could stay in power forever. When Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, one of the first things he did was he either exiled or imprisoned or killed all of his rivals. It's estimated he's put over 1 million Communist Party members in jail. Right? Even Donald Trump didn't want to give up the power after he lost the election. But Jesus gave it all up in order to save, in order to serve. All right, he took on the nature of a servant. But if that's not mind-blowing enough, okay, the act of service he came to earth to perform was to die on a cross. Verse 8. And that's what we're here to celebrate here on Good Friday, is it not? When Jesus stepped in as our substitute and took the punishment that we, in all fairness, should be taking ourselves for our sin. But the truly mind-blowing thing about this is not that he did it. It's that he thought that was a fitting thing to do for God the Son. What I mean is this. When God the Father said to Jesus, now look, son, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go to earth and I want you to be born as a human baby and I want you to live a human life and I want you to die a human death. All right? What Jesus said was, of course, Father. Of course I will do that. Right? That befits who I am as God. Of course I will suffer and die for my people. That's what I do. One of my favourite Bible passages is when Jesus washes the disciples' feet. It's in John chapter 13. But John chapter 13 begins with these words. This is John 13 verse 3. Jesus knew the Father had put all things under his power. All things under his power. Now, what does that mean? It means even though Jesus had emptied himself of all glory and honour and power, he had just received that infinite power back. He was now ruler of the entire universe once again. And what was the first thing he did? He got down on his hands and knees and he washed his disciples' feet. Why? Because it is befitting for God to humbly serve his followers. And as we know, washing the disciples' feet was an illustration of the humble service he was going to perform the following day on the cross. It's just what Jesus does. He serves. Now, as our regulars will know, Jesus' death is not just an example for us to follow. Right? If it was, we would leave church here every week completely crushed. Right? How on earth am I going to live up to this perfect example of service, of humble service? No, Jesus' death is not just an example for us to follow, it is a gift for us to receive. The way we live a life worthy, all right, this is the how of living a life worthy. Right? It's not just by following Jesus' example, it's by realizing his example of humble service was for us. Good Friday is for us. And so the how of humbly putting the interests ahead of others, ahead of our own, is by realizing that that's what Jesus has done for us. But our passage doesn't end there. Paul then says this in verse 9. Therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, right? Because Jesus performed the ultimate act of humble service, the Father exalted him to the ultimate position of power and status. And this is what God does, right? Not once, but twice in the New Testament are we told this. This is in James chapter 4 and 1 Peter chapter 5. It says, God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. That shows up twice in the New Testament. God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. Right? The way God works, the way he's set up his universe, is that if we seek greatness for ourselves, if we are proud, it will always blow up in our face. Right? Not only are Putin and Xi Jinping now considered pariahs around the globe, they are even hated in their own countries. Xi is paranoid of assassination attempts in China. Now compare them with George Washington. Most Aussies know George Washington as the first president of the United States. What you may not know was that he was the commander-in-chief of the US Army during the American War of Independence. He led the US Army in defeating the British. And at the end of the war, many speculated that he would use his position of incredible power to just pronounce himself the first king of America. Right? Yet 1 month after the last British troops left New York, he resigned his commission as commander-in-chief, giving the army back to the US Congress. When King George III of England was told that George Washington was going to resign, he said, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. Is it any wonder that just a few years later he was elected the first president of the United States with the majority of electoral votes from every single state? And that's what happens when we look to the interests of others ahead of our own. Right? We are elevated, raised up. We receive the favour of the Lord, which is considerable. And so as we close today, I'd like to say two things by way of application. The first is to our regulars. Right? One of the things that makes our church truly beautiful is that it is full of all different kinds of people. All right? We have people of different ages, different genders, different cultures, different races. It's a thing of beauty. But what those differences mean is there will be conflict from time to time. Now that conflict may be as small as a simple disagreement or as big as someone really hurting you. In the church at Philippi, there are actually 2 women who were quarrelling. We hear about that in chapter 4, right? Now, if you and I want to live a worthy life, if you and I want to be the D'Artagnan, all right, of the Musketeers, the way we do that is by seeking the interests of others ahead of our own. And what's that going to look like? Well, friends, even if someone hurts you, right, even if it gets that bad, what do? We pray for God's blessing upon them. We treat them as we would treat our good friends. We don't put them down or gossip about them behind our backs. In fact, we give up our wants and needs for theirs, just like we would anyone in our church, right? That is what it means to live a life worthy of the gospel. My second piece of application is for those here who may not have given their life to Jesus yet, or may not be living as a Christian, as one of Jesus' disciples. Can I begin by saying how awesome it is that you're here today? We pray you come back, all right? Please stick around after the service for some morning tea. But to you, I would say that if George Washington was the greatest man on earth for humbly resigning his power as commander-in-chief of the US Army, then Jesus is the greatest man in history. He humbled himself by giving up infinite power, glory, honour and comfort. And he did so to suffer infinitely, taking the punishment we rightly deserve. He suffered hell so that you and I don't have to. Now, friends, even if you don't believe in a God who would humble himself for you, don't you secretly wish he were true? If so, can I commend to you today, I recommend that you consider Christ this Good Friday, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking on the very nature of a servant.